Money bought an empire, and then quietly bought its farewell. How does a country that once measured its power in docks and mandarins end with ledgers, lines of credit, and cancelled repayments that echo across decades? What precise chain of financial choices turned global reach into a balance sheet problem no war chest could fix? Stay with this, because the money story is the missing plot line of Britain's twilight. Imagine London in 1946, coal smoke in the Thames, ration books in pockets, ministers arguing over whether to cut standards of living or to borrow. The picture is brightened by one cold fact. Public debt at the end of the Second World War ballooned to roughly 2.5 times Britain's entire annual output. That number was not arithmetic. It was a policy choice with a price tag. What did Britain do next, and who paid for its presence in faraway ports and palaces? The origin is simple and human. Centuries of imperial infrastructure, the forts, the commissariat chains, the fleet, were paid for by credit as much as by coins. Wars turned that credit into mountains. After 1918, the government had borrowed heavily from across the Atlantic. By 1934, much of that debt remained unresolved. After 1945, the problem repeated at a larger scale. Britain had fought twice, and victory had a bill attached. The United States offered a lifeline, a low-interest loan of $3.75 billion, repayable over decades, and framed in the language of alliance. The loan kept Britain afloat, but it came with strings that tugged in ways not everyone in Whitehall had fully reckoned with. What did those strings look like when pulled? The financial mechanics were plain and relentless. The loan staved off immediate collapse, but it also obliged Britain to defend an empire that no longer paid its bills. A government can run deficits, print money, or borrow from abroad. Britain did all three in different measures. Printing would have stoked inflation and smashed savings. Cutting living standards would have toppled governments. Borrowing from a richer creditor borrowed time and ceded leverage. The loan was a bridge. It was not a long road. What happened when the bridge met hard weather? In 1947, the weather arrived. Britain tried to make sterling convertible again to dollars. The rest of the world, sitting on sterling balances built from wartime trade and imperial receipts, asked for dollars. In months, gold and dollar reserves drained at an astonishing pace. Outflows leaped from under $1 billion to more than $4 billion. Convertibility stalled, and with it, confidence. The image is small and sharp. Clerks in Bombay and Calcutta counting sterling balances, shipping manifests piled on a desk, the registrar writing convertible and then striking it through. How do you maintain global commitments when your currency cannot be trusted across a border? That financial squeeze forced political choices that were always also moral and often brutal. Maintaining garrisons across Asia and the Middle East required dollars to buy oil, food, and material, but dollars were scarce. The choice boiled down to two public goods: uphold empire or raise living standards at home. Keynes, who negotiated parts of the post-war financial settlement, warned that the loan was needed for political and military outlay overseas. The argument was stark: keep the bases or watch the outposts fold. The loan bought time, but time can be bought only until markets demand payment. What was the human face of that arithmetic? Picture a single vignette: a young sergeant in Aden, wiping rain from his pack, writing home that the barracks were cold because coal was shipped to meet diplomatic needs in another continent. He had saved every packet of tobacco he could, counting coins by lamplight. Back in London, a Treasury official closed a ledger and penciled in, "Defer payments." The sergeant's cold was an entry in a book. The ledger closed. Who lost and who balanced the loss on the books? The breaking point came not with a single drama, but with a series of smaller collapses, currency crises, shortages, and the slow recognition that imperial revenues could not cover imperial obligations led to withdrawal at scale. India's independence in 1947 was the loud, visible break. But the financial story ran deeper. Empire had been financed by borrowing, by the export of goods, and by an informal tax on colonies. When global markets tightened, that tax failed. The British state discovered a truth that is universal. Sovereignty without sustainable finance is theatrical and temporary. Why did decolonization accelerate once the ledgers were opened? Because the math was unforgiving. Servicing long-term loans required export earnings and confidence in sterling. Currency convertibility and favorable trade terms mattered more than pride. As ports were handed over and dominions took new routes, Britain traded territorial reach for relative financial stability. The loan itself remained an archaeological relic of policy choices. Britain paid off those loans, but not quickly. The account was kept open for decades, and the last formal installments were only made in December 2006. Imagine a modern finance minister pressing keys to send the last payment for commitments written in the aftermath of global war. What does that final keystroke mean for memory and power? That late payment is a narrative pivot. It tells us that debts are not merely economic. They are social and moral contracts that stretch generations. And it gives us a number to return to, the anchor we keep repeating because it explains scale. Public debt peaked at roughly 2.5 times national output after the war. Repeat that, roughly 2.5 times. It is a statistic that explains why decisions were so stark and why the empire could not be sustained by will alone. How does that number echo in our own time? If this makes you look at your bank balance or the way governments promise tomorrow our services today, hit subscribe and we will keep pulling these threads. That is not a pitch. It is a promise to follow where the numbers go. The fallout was both geopolitical and domestic. Financial strain hastened the dismantling of colonial rule because Britain could not both subsidize far-off administrations and rebuild a battered economy at home. Homefront policies, the creation of the welfare state, the National Health Service, mass housing, were paid for out of constrained budgets. The redistribution that shaped modern Britain was financed in the shadow of war. The consequence was paradoxical. Britain relinquished imperial rule, yet built a stronger social settlement at home, funded by a mixture of credit, taxation, and an austere fiscal discipline that lasted for decades. How often do we see loss and gain folded into the same ledger? There is a modern mirror. Governments today face high public debt and tight global markets. The United Kingdom in recent years has again needed to negotiate fiscal reality with political choice. When debt saturates national output, policy options narrow. The lesson is not that empires fall because of foreign enemies. They fall because of arithmetic that becomes political. Debt shapes where governments can soldier, where they must cut spending, and what they can promise citizens. What choices do modern leaders make when the markets call the tune? 3 takeaways follow from this story. First, large war or policy bills that are financed by borrowing change the conversation about power. Military reach shrinks when balance of payments do. Second, loans and credit are political levers. Creditors can shape policy without firing a shot. Third, Domestic welfare and foreign commitments are often trade-offs that present clear choices, not just moral dilemmas. Reflect on Britain's silence about its last wartime payments in 2006. There was a small ceremony, a transfer of funds, and a line in a ledger closed. But remembering this matters. History taught that financial leverage can outlast flags and fleets, and that ledgers can be more telling than treaties. The next time a government promises perpetual protection overseas or boundless spending at home, ask which side of the ledger it intends to balance. If this shifted how you see history and money, join us, subscribe, and let us keep tracing the secret accounts that lie beneath the headlines. The past is paid for. The next account is opening.